Coffee scalded her skin as the arrogant billionaire laughed at her weight. He thought she was just a chubby nobody serving eggs in a rundown Brooklyn diner. He didn't know the terrifying boss of the Moretti family was watching from a dark corner, and he had just sealed his own fate. Monday mornings at Rosa's Diner on 3rd Avenue in Bay Ridge were usually a symphony of clinking silverware and low murmurs. Avery Russo loved the morning shift. At 24, she was painfully aware that she didn't fit the mold of a trendy New York City girl. She was soft, heavy-set, and carried her weight in her hips and stomach, a fact that had made her a target for cruel remarks since high school. But in the diner, hidden behind a slightly faded pink apron, she felt safe. She knew her regulars. She poured a perfect cup of dark roast, and she always remembered who took sugar and who took sweetener. Rain lashed against the large glass windows, blurring the bustling Brooklyn street outside. Avery wiped down the laminate counter, tucking a stray lock of dark curly hair behind her ear. Bradley Hayes pushed through the heavy glass door, bringing a gust of cold, damp air with him. Bradley was the youngest vice president at Kensington, and Tierney, a cutthroat wealth management firm in Manhattan. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Avery's annual rent, and his slicked-back hair smelled of expensive oud and entitlement. He had only come to Bay Ridge because his foreign sports car had caught a flat tire on the Belt Parkway, forcing him to seek refuge, while a private tow service was dispatched. Avery approached his booth with her usual warm, nervous smile, holding a steaming carafe of house-blend coffee. "Good morning, sir. Can I get you started with a cup of coffee?" she asked, her voice gentle. Bradley didn't even look up from his ringing smartphone. He was frantically scrolling through messages, a deep scowl etched into his sharp features. "Just pour it, sweetheart, and don't drown it in cheap milk." Avery nodded carefully, lifting the heavy glass pot. She had dealt with rude customers before. It was a hazard of the service industry. But as she leaned in to fill his porcelain mug, Bradley suddenly aggressively shoved his arm out, completely oblivious to his surroundings, as he shouted into his phone. "I told you to dump the offshore accounts!" He barked into the receiver. His elbow slammed violently into Avery's wrist. The heavy carafe slipped from her grip. Scalding fresh off the burner coffee splashed directly onto Avery's forearm and completely soaked the front of her white cotton blouse. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. She stumbled backward, clutching her burning arm, her eyes watering instantly as the searing heat dug into her skin. Instead of apologizing, Bradley slammed his phone onto the table and stood up, looking at the tiny splatter of coffee that had narrowly missed his Italian leather shoes. He sneered, looking Avery up and down with absolute disgust. "Are you completely blind or just entirely uncoordinated?" Bradley snapped his voice, carrying across the suddenly quiet diner. "Look what you almost did to a $4,000 suit." I'm so sorry," Avery stammered, tears springing to her eyes. Her arm was throbbing, a bright, angry red welt already forming on her pale skin. "You hit my arm. Oh, save it!" Bradley interrupted, stepping closer and lowering his voice to a cruel, mocking pitch. "Maybe if you lost 100 pounds, you wouldn't be bumping into everything. Try laying off the pancakes, sweetheart. You're taking up the entire damn aisle." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over Rosa's Diner. Avery's cheeks burned hotter than the coffee on her skin. She wrapped her arms around her thick waist, suddenly feeling massive, exposed, and entirely worthless. The familiar sting of body-shaming paralyzed her. She just wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Bradley tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto the table. "Buy yourself a diet soda," he spat, grabbing his briefcase and storming out into the rain. Avery stood, frozen hot tears finally spilling over her thick eyelashes, cutting tracks through the dusting of flour on her cheeks. She hurried toward the swinging kitchen doors, desperate to hide her humiliation. She never noticed the man sitting in the shadowy corner booth. Cameron Moretti didn't say a word. He didn't have to. At 32, Cameron was the undisputed head of the Moretti Crime Syndicate, an organization that controlled the ports, the underground casinos, and a vast network of politicians from Albany to Manhattan. He was a man carved from marble and violence, with eyes the color of a bruised sky, and a reputation that made hardened criminals cross the street. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater, his massive tattooed forearms resting casually on the table. But the air around him had turned to ice. Cameron came to Rosa's diner every single morning at exactly 7 a.m. He never ordered food. He only ordered black coffee, and he only let Avery serve him. To the underworld, Cameron was a monster. But to Avery he was just Dom, the quiet, handsome regular who tipped $100 a week and always asked about her sick mother. She didn't know that 3 months ago, when a rival gang had ambushed Cameron in a nearby alley, it was Avery who had found him bleeding out near the diner's dumpsters. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't called the cops. She had simply dragged his heavy bleeding frame into the diner's pantry, locked the door, and spent 3 hours stitching a bullet wound in his shoulder, with trembling hands, weeping quietly, because she couldn't bear the thought of a stranger dying alone in the cold. She had saved his life. And from that night on, Cameron Moretti's black, empty heart belonged entirely to the soft, chubby waitress who thought she was invisible to the world. To Cameron, Avery's lush, heavy curves were a sanctuary. Her kindness was the only pure thing in his violently corrupt world. She was his secret obsession, his greatest weakness, and he protected her from the shadows with the ruthless efficiency of an apex predator. Slowly, Cameron stood up from his booth. He didn't look angry. In his world, anger was loud and sloppy. Cameron looked dead. He pulled out his encrypted phone and dialed a single number. "Leo!" Cameron said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "There's a man in a charcoal suit walking toward an Aston Martin on 86th Street. Get his plates. Get his name. Get his address." "Done, boss," his underboss replied instantly. Cameron hung up the phone. He walked past the spilled coffee, pushed open the swinging kitchen doors, and stepped into the back room to find his crying angel. Avery was leaning over the stainless steel prep sink, running freezing cold water over her blistering forearm. Her chest heaved with heavy, ragged sobs. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the utter humiliation. Bradley's words echoed in her mind, tearing down the fragile walls of self-confidence she had spent years trying to build, taking up the entire damn aisle. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could carve away her own flesh. "Move your arm," a deep, rough voice ordered softly. Avery jumped, gasping, as she spun around. Cameron stood in the narrow kitchen aisle. He seemed to take up all the space in the room, his broad shoulders practically brushing the metal shelving racks. "Dom, you can't be back here." She sniffled hurriedly, trying to wipe her wet cheeks with her dry hand. "Customers aren't allowed in the kitchen." Cameron ignored her. He stepped into her personal space, his imposing presence instantly making her feel small, something she had rarely experienced in her life. He reached out his massive, calloused hands, gently wrapping around her uninjured wrist. His touch was incredibly tender, a jarring contrast to his dangerous appearance. He pulled her arm back under the cold water. "Keep it there. The burn needs to cool." He instructed, his eyes tracing the red, angry skin on her forearm. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle ticked under his olive skin. "Does it hurt?" "It's okay," she lied, her voice shaking. "I'm clumsy. I should have been watching where I was standing." "Do not lie to me, Piccola," Cameron murmured. using the Italian pet name that always made Avery's stomach flutter. Little one. And do not take the blame for the sins of an arrogant pig. He reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out a clean, monogrammed silk handkerchief. He carefully patted her arm dry, his thumbs brushing lightly over her soft, dimpled skin. Avery held her breath. She was always intensely aware of her body terrified, that people would find her flesh repulsive. But the way Cameron looked at her, he looked at her like she was priceless art. "I have some burn cream in the first aid kit," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'll get it," Cameron said. He retrieved the white box from the wall, opened it, and gently applied the cooling ointment to her burn. "You're going home, Penny. Your shift is over." "I can't afford to lose the hours, Dom. My mum's physical therapy bills are paid for," Cameron interrupted smoothly. Avery blinked up at him, confused. "What? I said I will speak to Rosa. You will not lose your wages," Cameron corrected, smoothly masking his slip. He had secretly bought the diner a month ago, through a shell company, just to ensure Avery was treated well by management. He had also secretly routed anonymous grants to her mother's clinic. "Go home, Avery. Rest," he ordered, gently pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the top of her dark, curly head. "I have some business to attend to." 20 miles away in Manhattan, Bradley Hayes was in a terrible mood. His suit was ruined, his car was in the shop, and his offshore accounts were bleeding. But his biggest problem wasn't the stock market. It was his gambling addiction. Bradley paced the floor of his luxury penthouse in Tribeca, pouring himself a generous glass of scotch. He owed $400,000 to an underground sports book operating out of Queens. He had been dodging their calls for 3 weeks, confident that his status as a Wall Street VP would protect him from low-level bookies. His cell phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Hayes speaking," he snapped, taking a sip of his drink. "Mr. Hayes?" A smooth, chillingly calm voice replied. "My name is Leonardo. I represent the financial interests of the creditors you have been avoiding for the last 21 days. Bradley rolled his eyes. "Look, I told your people my assets are tied up in an escrow account. You'll get your money by Friday. Stop harassing me." "We are past the point of phone calls, Mr. Hayes," Leonardo replied. "My employer wishes to see you. Tonight, 8 o'clock, the cellar of the Velvet Lounge on Mulberry Street. I strongly suggest you do not miss this appointment." The line went dead. Bradley frowned, a cold spike of genuine fear finally piercing his arrogant armor. The Velvet Lounge was notoriously exclusive, a well-known front for the highest echelons of organized crime in the city. The people who owned that club didn't send men to break legs. They made people disappear completely. At 7:55 p.m., Bradley walked into the Velvet Lounge. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive bourbon. 2 enormous men in tailored suits patted him down at the door, taking his phone and his keys without a word. They escorted him down a dimly lit hallway and opened a heavy soundproof mahogany door. The basement room was vast and bare, save for a single leather armchair in the center and a long wooden table at the far end. Standing behind the table, pouring a glass of amber liquid, was a man shrouded in shadow. "Sit," one of the guards ordered, shoving Bradley hard into the leather chair. Bradley adjusted his blazer, trying to project a confidence he suddenly didn't feel. "Look, I know I'm late on the payments, but I can pay double the interest. I have liquidity coming in." The man behind the table stepped into the dim overhead light. Bradley's breath hitched. It was the quiet, massive guy from the diner in Brooklyn, the one sitting in the corner booth. Cameron Moretti slowly unbuttoned the cuffs of his dark shirt, rolling up the sleeves to reveal intricate, sprawling tattoos of wolves and daggers across his forearms. His expression was completely blank, devoid of any human emotion. "Do you know who I am, Mr. Hayes?" Cameron asked, his voice low, echoing ominously against the concrete walls. Bradley swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. I know you hold my marker. I owe you $400,000. Cameron let out a dark, humorless chuckle. It sounded like gravel grinding together. He walked slowly around the table, approaching Bradley like a wolf circling a wounded deer. $400,000 is pocket change, Bradley, Cameron said softly, stopping right in front of the chair. I make that before I finish my morning coffee. Bradley's heart pounded violently in his chest. Then why am I here? What do you want? Cameron leaned down, placing a heavy hand on each armrest, trapping Bradley in the chair. The smell of expensive cologne and sheer danger radiated from the mafia boss. This morning you walked into a diner in Bay Ridge. Cameron whispered, his eyes narrowing into cold, lethal slits. You raised your voice, you threw your weight around, and then you spilled boiling liquid on the skin of the only woman I have ever loved. Bradley's blood ran ice cold. His mind raced, flashing back to the chubby waitress he had berated just 12 hours earlier. The soft, heavy-set girl in the pink apron. The waitress. Bradley stammered, true panic setting in. You're doing this over a fat diner girl. The moment the word fat left Bradley's mouth, the temperature in the room plummeted to absolute zero. Cameron didn't yell. He didn't blink. He simply raised his massive fist and drove it directly into Bradley's jaw with the force of a freight train. Bone crunched sickeningly. Bradley flew backward out of the chair, crashing onto the hard concrete floor, blood instantly spraying from his mouth as he screamed in agony. "Pick him up!" Cameron commanded his men, stepping back and wiping a single drop of blood from his knuckles with a silk handkerchief. The two guards hoisted a sobbing, completely terrified Bradley back into the chair. Cameron leaned in close to Bradley's bloody ear. "She is a queen," Cameron whispered violently. "And you are a dead man who doesn't even know it yet." Avery sat frozen on the worn velvet couch inside her cramped, drafty apartment on 86th Street in Bensonhurst, staring completely blankly at the flickering television screen. The severe burn on her forearm throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, heavily covered by the thick white medical ointment Cameron had applied with such shocking tenderness. Her exhausted mind, however, was miles away from the intense, physical pain radiating up her arm. It was firmly, unavoidably anchored to the deeply traumatic memory of Bradley Hayes's cruel, cutting voice echoing endlessly through the quiet morning air of Rosa's diner. "Try laying off the pancakes, sweetheart." She wrapped her trembling arms tightly around her thick waist, burying her tear-stained face into a faded floral throw pillow. Why did it always have to hurt so incredibly much? She had spent 24 years desperately navigating a harsh, unforgiving world that constantly demanded women be exceptionally sharp, thin, and conventionally flawless. Her remarkably soft, heavy curves constantly felt like a heavy, suffocating armor. She simply couldn't take off a permanent physical trait that practically invited arrogant men to tear down her carefully constructed self-esteem. Her beloved mother Sophia was fast asleep in the adjacent tiny bedroom, heavily sedated, and recovering from her latest grueling physical therapy session at Mount Sinai Hospital. Avery let out a long, shaky sigh, forcing her heavy legs to stand up so she could brew some calming chamomile tea. As the rusty copper kettle finally began to whistle on the ancient gas stove, a truly frantic, terrifyingly aggressive pounding suddenly erupted at her front door. Avery instantly froze in pure terror. It was well past midnight on a Tuesday. Her anxious heart hammered violently against her ribs as she quietly tiptoed toward the peephole, terrified of what might be waiting on the other side. Standing out in the dimly lit grim hallway of her building was Bradley Hayes. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, impeccably groomed Wall Street vice president who had brutally humiliated her that morning. His bespoke, wildly expensive charcoal suit was violently torn and heavily stained with dark, rusty patches of fresh blood. His once handsome face was a horrifically swollen purple mess, his bottom jaw visibly hanging at a sickening, completely unnatural angle. He was loudly, wildly sobbing, desperately, clutching a ruined brown leather briefcase tightly to his heaving chest like a makeshift shield. Absolute panic seized Avery's lungs, freezing her in place. How on earth did this terrifying man know exactly where she lived? She desperately fumbled in her apron pocket for her cracked cell phone, fully ready to dial the police emergency line when Bradley suddenly slumped heavily against her front door, his muffled, incredibly desperate voice bleeding clearly through the cheap, thin wood. "Please!" Bradley begged pitifully, his messy words aggressively slurring through his badly shattered jaw. "Please, Avery, I am begging you to open the door. I will gladly give you absolutely anything you want. I will legally transfer my entire multi-million-dollar portfolio at Kensington and Tierney directly to you tonight. Just please call him off. You have to call him off." Avery frowned deeply, profound confusion, violently warring with her mounting terror. "Call who off? I don't know what you are talking about," she shouted back loudly, deliberately, keeping the heavy brass deadbolt locked tight. "Go away immediately, or I am calling the cops right now." "The cops all work directly for him," Bradley wailed hysterically, slowly sliding down the wooden door until he was sitting pathetically on the dirty hallway floor. "Cameron Moretti literally owns the police. He owns the shipping docks. He owns the Velvet Lounge. He owns the whole damn city. He is going to murder me, Avery. He dragged me deep into a concrete basement and shattered my face because I insulted you, because he loves you. Please, you have to tell the terrifying boss of the Moretti family to let me live." The stovetop kettle screamed loudly from the dark kitchen, but Avery couldn't hear it over the deafening roaring in her ears. Cameron Moretti, the supreme boss of the infamous Moretti crime family. Her overwhelmed mind violently scrambled to properly process the horrifying information. Dom, quiet, incredibly gentle Dom who generously tipped $100 every week and always politely asked about her mother's sciatica. The mysteriously wounded man she had desperately stitched up in the diner's dusty pantry exactly 3 months ago. He wasn't just some tough, quiet guy from the neighborhood. He was the undisputed, absolutely lethal apex predator of the entire New York underworld. Suddenly the heavy, incredibly rhythmic sound of ascending footsteps echoed loudly up the concrete stairwell. Bradley gasped loudly, letting out a horrific feral sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Avery looked quickly through the small glass peephole again. Leonardo Cameron's terrifyingly calm, impeccably dressed underboss stepped smoothly onto the landing. He was heavily flanked by 2 absolutely massive men wearing perfectly tailored black suits. Leonardo didn't even look slightly angry. He merely looked like a bored man completing a highly mundane clerical task. He swiftly grabbed Bradley by the torn collar of his ruined suit and hoisted him up effortlessly, entirely ignoring the man's pathetic, high-pitched screams. "Mr. Hayes," Leonardo said, incredibly smoothly, his deep voice entirely devoid of any human warmth. "You were explicitly, repeatedly instructed to leave the city immediately. Bothering the boss's beloved woman at her private residence was a fatally stupid miscalculation. No, I just wanted to personally apologize to her," Bradley screamed wildly, fighting desperately as the 2 large, silent men expertly restrained his thrashing arms. Before Avery could even begin to logically process what was actually happening outside her apartment, another remarkably imposing figure slowly emerged from the dark shadows of the stairwell. Cameron. He was dressed flawlessly, in a perfectly tailored pitch-black suit, his expensive silk tie slightly loosened, radiating a genuinely overwhelming aura of absolute terrifying authority. He didn't even bother to look down at Bradley. His piercing, deeply stormy eyes were locked directly onto Avery's door peephole, acting as if he could see right through the solid wood and peer directly into her terrified, trembling soul. "Get him out of her building immediately," Cameron commanded, incredibly softly. The absolute chilling lack of emotion in his deep voice was infinitely scarier than a furious scream. Ensure he literally never sets foot inside the state of New York ever again. Liquidate his remaining offshore bank accounts entirely, and wire the remaining funds anonymously to the pediatric ward at Mount Sinai. "Consider it done, boss." Leonardo nodded respectfully. They ruthlessly dragged a loudly sobbing, desperately pleading Bradley away, his pathetic cries echoing and slowly fading down the long concrete stairwell until the dark hallway was entirely silent. Cameron firmly remained standing directly in front of Avery's locked door. He slowly, gently placed his exceptionally large, heavily calloused hand entirely flat against the cheap wood. "Penny," Cameron murmured quietly, his deep voice incredibly rich, noticeably rough, and dripping heavily with an entirely different kind of shocking vulnerability. "Open the door, Piccola. Please. Let me explain everything to you." Trembling completely uncontrollably, Avery slowly reached up her shaking hand and carefully turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The door clicked open loudly. Avery immediately stepped back instinctively, wrapping her soft arms highly protectively around her heavily plush stomach. Cameron slowly stepped cautiously inside, instantly filling the tiny, deeply cramped apartment with the intoxicating masculine scent of expensive sandalwood, rich Cuban cigar smoke, and sheer, unfiltered danger. He quietly closed the wooden door behind him and firmly locked it deliberately, locking out the highly brutal, violent world he completely ruled. When he slowly turned around to look at her trembling frame, the cold, utterly dead eyes of the terrifying mafia boss were completely gone. In their absolute place stood a deeply vulnerable man. He was entirely consumed by total unyielding devotion. "You are a monster," Avery whispered, shakily, her sweet voice violently cracking under the immense pressure. Hot, salty tears streamed rapidly down her perfectly round, heavily flushed cheeks. "You are the real Cameron Moretti. The Evening News repeatedly says you completely run the illegal shipping ports. They loudly claim you ruthlessly had the rival Gambino brothers violently killed right outside Peter Luger Steakhouse." "I absolutely am," Cameron confessed softly, without a single solitary ounce of hesitation or regret. He deliberately did not step any closer, highly respecting her obvious fear completely. "I am absolutely everything the horrible rumors boldly say I am, Penny. I am a deeply ruthless man, operating constantly in a highly ruthless, unforgiving world. But I am fundamentally not a terrifying monster to you. I will absolutely never ever be a monster to you. Why?" She sobbed loudly, frantically, gesturing wildly to her heavy, remarkably soft physical frame. "Look closely at me, Dom. I am literally just a very chubby, highly forgettable waitress, constantly working grueling shifts for terrible minimum wage. I am completely invisible. Arrogant men like Bradley Hayes openly look at me and only see jokes. Why would a supremely powerful man who literally rules the entire city ever care deeply about someone exactly like me?" Cameron's sharp, masculine jaw clenched noticeably tight. In 3 incredibly long, highly determined strides, he swiftly closed the entire physical distance between them. He importantly did not grab her aggressively or forcefully. Instead, he shockingly dropped heavily to his knees, right there on the deeply faded, ugly linoleum floor of her tiny kitchen. He gently wrapped his massive, beautifully tattooed arms securely around her thick, plush waist, carefully burying his handsome face completely against her incredibly soft stomach. Avery gasped. Her small, shaking hands instinctively flew down to grip his thick, dark hair. The absolute most dangerous, deeply feared man on the entire eastern seaboard was willingly kneeling right at her feet like a completely devout, obsessed worshipper. Ignorant men exactly like Bradley Hayes are totally blind, pathetic fools, Cameron rasped deeply, his incredibly rough voice shaking slightly with overwhelming emotion. He slowly looked up at her beautiful face, his dark eyes shining brightly, with fierce, unapologetically raw reverence. You are definitely not invisible, Avery. You are the literal bright sun. The horrific night I desperately dragged myself there bleeding. You miraculously saved my worthless life. You remain the only truly pure, remarkably beautiful thing in my entire corrupted existence. I fiercely love your amazing softness. I deeply love your incredible kindness. I completely love absolutely every single inch of this stunningly gorgeous body that you constantly try to hide, sadly behind those terrible pink aprons. You are my beautiful queen, and tonight I happily, ruthlessly burned Bradley Hayes's entire pathetic world completely to the ground, simply because he dared to make you cry. Avery stared at him, her chest heaving rapidly. She finally felt entirely and totally, profoundly secure. "There is actually something else you must urgently know," Cameron murmured gently, carefully pressing a highly tender, lingering kiss firmly onto her forehead. "Your sweet mother's massive medical debt, the truly suffocating loans you are painfully paying off. Sophia tragically borrowed heavily from ruthless mafia loan sharks 2 years ago. You absolutely do not ever need to worry about them anymore. Exactly 3 months ago, right after you expertly stitched my bleeding shoulder, I secretly bought her entire crippling debt. I completely wiped it clean forever. I also fully bought the local diner completely for you to permanently legally own." Avery's weak knees buckled instantly. Cameron smoothly pulled her exceptionally lush, heavily soft curves completely flush against his totally hard, muscular chest. He swiftly closed the tiny remaining distance, firmly pressing his demanding lips deeply against hers, in a highly searing, remarkably possessive kiss. It was an unbreakable permanent promise, forever sealed in total unyielding romantic devotion. Exactly 1 incredibly eventful year later, the highly secretive underground criminal landscape of New York City had completely fundamentally shifted. Cameron deeply ruled the massive syndicate empire alongside his remarkably beautiful, gorgeously chubby new mafia queen, ruling everything powerfully, side by absolute side. What an absolutely wild twist of fate for Avery and Cameron. True love really does conquer all, even the darkest corners of the New York underworld. If you loved this intense mafia romance story and want to hear more thrilling tales of unexpected love, revenge, and drama, please hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance readers and subscribe to our channel for more amazing daily stories. See you next time. Goodbye.